Sony FX30 versus Sony's A6400. Do you see the $1,000 difference? What features and functionality actually make up the $1,000 price difference between these two cameras? I'm examining these two cameras from their build, functionality, and image quality to help you decide if you should upgrade or not from your current setup. Before you feel the camera's price difference in your wallet, you'll feel it in your hands. Though both of these are made of magnesium alloy, the A6400 weighs in at 403 grams with a slimmer profile than the FX30, which comes in at 646 grams. But that extra weight isn't for nothing, since unlike the A6400, it's got fans in the body. This helps prevent overheating, which can be vital when you're shooting 4K for a prolonged period of time. Overheating becomes more likely when shooting at higher frame rates too. But as long as you got those fans, you're good. I shoot 4K on this camera all the time and the fan is hardly audible at all in any of the footage. You may start to see the A6400 overheat in an hour or two when shooting 4K in less ventilated spaces. So unless you're shooting bursts of 4K, prepare to wait for the cooldown, or be your own fan. Even if your camera doesn't overheat, because of the small battery, you may get an hour to an hour and a half of 4K. The FX30 has a bigger battery, the Z battery, which gets you at least 1 hour more than the A6400's battery. As you continue to operate the camera bodies, you'll be pleased to know that both have their fair share of custom buttons. The difference is that when you're using the A6400, the dedicated dials and buttons for photography are there. However, for video, you have to program your own buttons for video functions like white balance and focus magnification. The FX30 already has dedicated buttons for these functions, but not for photo. Don't worry, you can still reprogram these too, if you want to. For video functionality, the FX30 has 2 record buttons, potentially 3 if you want to record with a shutter button, and it can split the function menus for photography and video. On the A6400, you're only getting the main record button and the shutter button if you want to record with that, but your function menu is the same for both photo and video, so that's a little tedious. Where the A6400 does make up is that it does have a viewfinder, but that's okay because the A6400 body does have a feature that you can only get on bigger cinema cameras than the FX30, an electronic viewfinder. Yes, you can use this when shooting photos and videos, but let me know in the comments if you actually use the viewfinder a lot, because I didn't miss it when switching to the FX30. I shoot with the screen most of the time. The one thing that I did miss though was the mechanical shutter and the continuous shooting. If you prioritize these in your style of photography, these features alone may prevent you from switching to the FX30. More so that the FX30 doesn't shoot external flash with its available hot shoe. Although most of the Sony mirrorless camera bodies are very similar, here's one with a twist. What is normally the on and off switch in the right hand grip is a natural zoom rocker on the FX30 for power zooms and clear image zooms. The on and off switch for the FX30 is actually on the back of the camera on the left hand side. Since there's no zoom rocker on the A6400, you'd have to activate the clear image zoom by mapping the zoom function to a button and then use the D-pad to zoom in and out. If you bother with clear image zoom, that is. If you want the lightest and most minimal camera carry, the A6400 is the better of the two by its weight and size alone. It's just problematic when you want to use an external microphone because then you are forced to buy an accessory that helps you mount your camera on the side if you want to point that camera at yourself and use the flip screen. So if you're going to have a minimal camera rig, have confidence in the FX30. It was built with a cageless design as evident with their mounting points around the camera. The top mounting points though is really where the magic happens. Just slap on a NATO rail and you can start using your own top handles and mount the rest of your camera accessories like monitors and microphones from there. It's just that Condor Blue is the only company that sells one for the FX30 without a cage. But if you want to go cageless, this is the way. Once you're finally ready to get the best video footage, you'll be pleased to know that both of these cameras have picture profiles to maximize dynamic range in post-processing. The main differences are that in the Sony FX30, we don't have S-Log2, whereas in the Sony A6400 does. The FX30 does make up for it though with S-Cinetone, which is limited to the higher end full-frame cameras. But just keep this in mind if you're going to own both of these and you want to match the colors in post. Because S-Log3 footage works best for the FX30 and S-Log2 works better for the Sony A6400. But in case you're going to spend less time in post, the Sony FX30 provides embedded LUTs that we can output as the final image. You can also just shoot S-Log3 and just preview your LUTs for monitoring in camera if you still want to have flexibility in post. In order to have a similar experience out of the A6400, you'd have to have an external monitor like the Atomos Ninja 5 in order to output embedded LUTs in your footage. Speaking of accessories, you'll want to consider if gimbals are important in your workflow because the A6400 doesn't have any form of stabilization unless it's in a lens that you pair it with. The FX30 has the advantage with the latest in-body image stabilization with 5.5 stops of stabilization. You can really see the difference between how steady it is hand holding with active stabilization versus standard. If I'm going to be static, I'll use active stabilization, but if I want a little bit more movement, I'll just stay with the standard stabilization, as the active stabilization does tend to overcompensate sometimes. But of course, if you want more camera movement, then you may end up getting a gimbal if you don't already have one. But before talking more about video, when it comes to photos, for everyday pictures or even paid gigs, you can acceptably use either or both of these cameras. The shutter on the FX30 is silent, whereas the A6400 is audible. Just mind the FX30 and its hardware limitations. Although it's got the 26 megapixel sensor, it has no mechanical shutter and no continuous shooting. When it comes to side-by-side for video, both of these cameras are soft in 1080 compared to their 4K counterparts. So if you want the best image out of both, stay away from 1080. But if you want 4K at higher frame rates like 60 or 120 frames per second, the FX30 brings that, unlike the A6400, which is only limited to 4K 24 and 30 frames per second. Although these both shoot video well, neither of these cameras shoot RAW internally. However, externally, the Sony FX30 is capable of outputting 16-bit ProRes RAW. 12-bit though is the most monitors can do today. But yeah. 12-bit ProRes RAW. The FX30 is the best of these two cameras if you want Sony's best APS-C cameras for video, and sometimes photo. But for the hobbyists or new hybrid shooters, the A6400 is still the best choice. No amount of video features or functions can justify spending twice the money unless the A6400 really can't keep up with your video demands and how you film. Because if there's anything to know about these cameras, it's that you have... Oh man, camera overheated again. What I meant to say was, if there's anything to know about these cameras, it's choosing the right tool for the right job. So think about that when you watch my reviews of each camera over here.